What happens when two of America's most outspoken billionaires sit down for what was supposed to be a simple interview, and it turns into one of the most explosive exchanges ever broadcast on national television? Mark Cuban, the Dallas Mavericks owner turned political commentator, came face-to-face with former President Donald Trump on ABC News, and what unfolded was absolutely unprecedented. The tension was immediate, the arguments were fierce, and by the end, one of them walked off set. But before we get into what happened, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below telling me whose side you're on in this debate. Because trust me, you're going to have an opinion by the end of this video. The ABC News studio was set up for what the network had promoted as a major political interview. The moderator, a veteran journalist known for handling tough conversations, sat between the two chairs positioned at angles, creating an intimate yet confrontational setup. When Mark Cuban walked out first, he settled into his seat with the casual confidence of someone who had done thousands of interviews. Then came Donald Trump, and the energy in the room immediately shifted. The moderator started with what seemed like a softball question, asking Trump about his views on the current state of the American economy. Trump leaned forward, his voice carrying that familiar cadence as he began painting a picture of economic disaster under the current administration, claiming that when he was president, everything was better. The stock market was soaring, unemployment was at record lows, and America was respected again on the world stage. But before the moderator could even follow up, Mark Cuban interrupted. "Can I just stop you right there?" Cuban said, his tone sharp but controlled. "Because I think the American people deserve to hear facts, not this revisionist history you keep pushing." Trump turned to look at Cuban directly, his expression a mix of surprise and annoyance. "Excuse me, Mark, but I think my record speaks for itself. The greatest economy in the history of our country." Cuban shook his head slowly. "The greatest economy? You inherited a growing economy from Obama. Unemployment had been dropping for 6 straight years before you took office. The stock market had tripled under Obama. You just rode the wave and took credit for it." The moderator tried to regain control, but Trump was already responding. "That's completely false, Mark, and you know it. When I came in, the economy was a disaster. I had to fix everything. I brought back manufacturing. I cut taxes. I made deals that actually benefited American workers for once." Cuban leaned back in his chair, a slight smile crossing his face. "Manufacturing jobs? Let's talk about manufacturing jobs. You promised to bring back millions of manufacturing jobs. How many did you actually bring back? And more importantly, how many did we lose during your last year in office?" Trump's voice rose slightly. "We lost jobs because of a pandemic that came from China. Something nobody could have predicted. Nobody could have handled better than I did. We saved millions of lives with Operation Warp Speed." "Operation Warp Speed was a good program," Cuban conceded, "but it was built on research and infrastructure that had been funded for years before you got there. And as for handling the pandemic, you're really going to sit here and claim you handled it well? You disbanded the pandemic response team. You ignored the warnings. You told people it would just disappear like a miracle." The moderator interjected, trying to steer the conversation. "Gentlemen, let's talk about business experience, since you both come from the business world. President Trump, you've said that your business background made you the best qualified person to run the country. Mark, you've been critical of that assessment. Why?" Cuban didn't hesitate. "Because running a country is not like running a private company. In a private company, you can hide your losses, you can declare bankruptcy 6 times like Donald did, you can refuse to pay contractors, you can use other people's money to fund your lifestyle. You can't do that with a country. A country needs transparency, accountability, and actual competence." Trump's face reddened slightly. "I used the laws of this country to build a business empire. That's called being smart, Mark. And by the way, I never declared personal bankruptcy. My companies used bankruptcy laws to restructure, which is a completely normal business practice." "You've done the same thing." "I've never declared bankruptcy," Cuban shot back. "Not once. Not my companies, not me personally. And I've actually built real companies that created real value. I didn't just license my name to buildings and call myself a successful developer. Trump pointed a finger across the space between them. You sold your company for billions during the dot-com bubble, Mark. You got lucky with timing. I built actual real estate. Actual buildings that you can see and touch. Hotels, golf courses, properties all over the world. I built a company from nothing, Cuban said, his voice steady but intense. I wrote the code myself. I sold it. I made smart investments. And yes, I sold at the right time because I understood the market. That's not luck, that's intelligence. And those properties you're so proud of? How many of them have your name on them but aren't actually owned by you? How many are just licensing deals where you get paid to put your name on someone else's building? The moderator sensed an opportunity. President Trump, can you address that specific question? How many properties bearing your name do you actually own versus license? Trump waved his hand dismissively. I own many properties. And the ones where I license my name, people pay me tremendous amounts of money because the Trump name has value. It's a brand that's recognized all over the world. That's smart business, using your brand to create wealth. Cuban leaned forward. But that's my point exactly. You're not a builder, you're a marketer. There's nothing wrong with that. But stop pretending you're some kind of construction genius or business mastermind. You're good at self-promotion, I'll give you that. You might be the best at self-promotion that's ever existed. But actual business building? Creating real value? The evidence just doesn't support the myth. Trump's jaw tightened visibly. You know what, Mark? You sit there in your luxury in your bubble and you criticize me, but I actually got things done. I actually fought for the American worker. You just sit courtside at basketball games and tweet. What have you actually done for this country? What have I done? Cuban's eyebrows raised. I've created thousands of jobs. I've invested in hundreds of companies through Shark Tank that have employed tens of thousands of people. I've been honest about my successes and my failures. I haven't pretended to be something I'm not. And most importantly, I haven't tried to overturn an election when I lost. The room went completely silent for a moment. The moderator's eyes widened slightly, realizing the interview had just crossed into far more serious territory. Trump's expression hardened, and when he spoke, his voice was low and deliberate. I didn't lose that election, Mark. That election was stolen, and you know it. Millions of fraudulent votes, rigged machines, illegal ballots. If we had honest elections in this country, the results would have been very different. Cuban shook his head firmly. Stop, just stop, you lost. You lost by 7 million votes in the popular vote, and by the same electoral college margin, you called a landslide when you won. 60 federal judges, many of them appointed by you, looked at your evidence and threw out your cases. Your own Attorney General said there was no widespread fraud. Your own Department of Homeland Security called it the most secure election in American history. This is dangerous, what you're doing, continuing to lie about this. They're not lies, Trump insisted, his volume increasing. We have evidence, we have testimony, we have statistical impossibilities. You know what's dangerous? What's dangerous is allowing our elections to be compromised and people like you covering it up. The moderator tried to step in. President Trump, I think what Mark is asking for is specific evidence that would stand up in court. Your legal team had opportunities to present that evidence and were unable to convince judges. Trump turned to the moderator. The judges were afraid. They didn't want to get involved. They threw out cases on standing and technicalities. They never actually looked at the evidence. It was a rigged system from top to bottom. Cuban's voice cut through. This is exactly the problem. When you lose, it's rigged. When you win, it's fair. The judges were afraid. These are lifetime appointed federal judges, many who you appointed, and they're afraid? Of what? That's not how the judiciary works, and you know it. You're feeding your supporters a lie because you can't accept that you lost. I didn't lose, Trump repeated, his finger jabbing the air for emphasis. And by the way, Mark, you endorsed the other side, so of course you're going to say I lost. You wanted me to lose. You probably helped rig it. Cuban's laugh was sharp and humorless. Now I rigged the election? That's a new one. Add me to the list along with Dominion voting machines, dead Venezuelan dictators, Italian satellites, and whatever other conspiracy theory your team came up with. Do you hear yourself? Do you hear how insane this sounds? What's insane, Trump said, leaning forward intensely, is that people like you, with your money and your platform, spread lies about what really happened. You gaslight the American people. You tell them not to believe what they saw with their own eyes. What they saw with their own eyes? Cuban's voice rose for the first time. What they saw was you losing an election fair and square, and then you spending 2 months lying about it, culminating in you sending a mob to the Capitol to try to overturn the results. That's what people saw with their own eyes, Donald. The moderator sensed the need to redirect before things escalated further. Let's shift to policy for a moment. President Trump, you've talked about running again. What would your economic policy look like in a second term? Trump seemed to welcome the change in direction. It would be very simple. We'd bring back the Trump tax cuts, which, by the way, were the biggest tax cuts in history. We'd eliminate regulations that are strangling businesses. We'd renegotiate our trade deals. We'd bring manufacturing back from China. And we'd achieve energy independence again, which we had under my administration. Energy independence? Cuban jumped in immediately. We're producing more oil right now than we ever did under your administration. That's just a fact. You can look it up. Production has actually increased. And those tax cuts you're so proud of? They exploded the deficit by trillions of dollars, and the vast majority of the benefits went to corporations and the wealthy, not to working families. The tax cuts helped everyone, Trump countered. Small businesses, middle-class families, everyone got a tax cut. And corporations used that money to invest in America, to create jobs, to increase wages. It worked exactly as designed. Cuban pulled out his phone. Do you mind if I fact-check this in real time? Because I can pull up the actual data right now. The corporate tax rate went from 35% to 21%. Corporate profits soared. Stock buybacks hit record levels. But wage growth for average workers remained flat when adjusted for inflation. The money went to shareholders, not to workers. Trump waved dismissively. You can make statistics say whatever you want, Mark. I'm telling you what I saw in the real world. Companies were investing, people were getting bonuses, wages were going up. Before the pandemic hit, we had the greatest economy ever. You keep saying that, Cuban said, putting his phone down. The greatest economy ever. But by what metric? GDP growth was good but not exceptional. It was actually lower than several periods under Clinton and Reagan. Wage growth was mediocre. The only thing that was really exceptional was the stock market, and that benefited primarily the wealthy. The top 10% own 84% of all stocks. So when you talk about the stock market doing well, you're really talking about rich people getting richer. Everyone with a 401k benefited, Trump argued. Retirement accounts went through the roof. People were able to retire comfortably because of my policies. The moderator interjected with another question. Mark, you've been critical of some of President Trump's trade policies, particularly the tariffs on China. Can you explain your position? Cuban nodded. The China tariffs were a disaster. They were a tax on American consumers and American businesses. American companies pay the tariffs, not China, and they pass those costs on to consumers. We saw it in prices across the board. And what did we get for it? A trade deal that China immediately started violating, and then the pandemic hit, and the whole thing fell apart anyway. It was terrible policy based on a fundamental misunderstanding of how tariffs work. Trump's response was immediate and heated. The China tariffs were about finally standing up to China after decades of them ripping us off. They were stealing our intellectual property. They were manipulating their currency. They were flooding our markets with cheap goods and destroying American manufacturing. Someone had to stand up to them, and I did. And by the way, the current administration kept most of my tariffs in place because they know they work. Cuban's expression showed frustration. They kept some tariffs in place as leverage for negotiation, not because they think blanket tariffs are good policy. There's a difference between strategic use of tariffs and just slapping them on everything because you think it makes you look tough. And you still haven't addressed the fundamental point, which is that American consumers and businesses paid those tariffs, not China. You essentially raised taxes on Americans and called it a victory. It wasn't a tax increase, Trump insisted. It was making China pay their fair share. And it worked. We brought supply chains back to America. Companies started manufacturing here again instead of in China. Some companies reshuffled their supply chains, Cuban conceded, but mostly they just moved production to Vietnam, Mexico, or other countries. They didn't bring it back to America because American labor is more expensive. That's basic economics. You can't just tariff your way to cheap manufacturing. And the companies that did try to manufacture here? They struggled because the tariffs made their input costs higher. You hurt American manufacturers with those policies. The moderator saw an opening. Speaking of manufacturing and business, President Trump, there have been ongoing questions about your own business practices, including the investigation in New York. How do you respond to the allegations of financial fraud? Trump's demeanor shifted immediately to one of defensive outrage. It's a witch hunt. It's been a witch hunt from day one. They're trying to persecute me because I'm running for office again. The Democrat prosecutors, the Democrat judges, they're all working together to try to take me down because they know I'll win if I run, Cuban interjected before the moderator could follow up. Donald, banks, and insurance companies look at financial statements to make lending decisions. If you inflate the value of your assets to get better loan terms, that's fraud. It's not political persecution, it's basic accountability. You can't tell a bank your property is worth $800 million to get a loan, and then tell the tax assessor it's worth $18 million to pay less taxes. That's illegal. My accountants prepared those statements, Trump said firmly. I signed them, but I'm not an accountant. I rely on professionals. And the banks did their own due diligence. Nobody was hurt. The banks made money on the loans. There's no victim here. The victim is the system, Cuban responded, his voice steady but intense. The victim is every honest business owner who doesn't lie about their assets. The victim is the integrity of financial markets. And saying you relied on your accountants is not a defense when you signed statements that had a clause saying you were personally responsible for their accuracy. You can't have it both ways. Trump shook his head vigorously. This is exactly what I'm talking about. People like you, Mark. You want to use the legal system to come after your political opponents. You want to criminalize business decisions. It's the weaponization of justice, and it's destroying this country. I'm not weaponizing anything, Cuban said, his patience clearly wearing thin. I'm simply pointing out that the same laws that apply to everyone else should apply to you. You're not above the law just because you were president. In fact, you should be held to a higher standard because you were president. The moderator tried to move the conversation forward. Let's talk about your public statements and communication style. President Trump, you've been criticized for inflammatory rhetoric, particularly on social media. Mark, you've been vocal about this. Why does it concern you? Cuban turned slightly to face Trump more directly. Because words matter, especially when they come from someone in a position of power. When you call the press the enemy of the people, when you attack judges and prosecutors as corrupt simply because they rule against you, when you encourage violence against protesters, when you spread conspiracy theories, you're not just exercising free speech. You're degrading public discourse and undermining democratic institutions. Trump's response was sharp. I call out fake news when I see it. I call out corrupt judges when they make corrupt decisions. I stand up for my supporters when they're being treated unfairly. That's not inflammatory, that's called leadership. And by the way, the left says far worse things about me every single day. But nobody talks about that. There's a difference between criticism and incitement, Cuban said. There's a difference between disagreeing with a judge's ruling and calling them corrupt with no evidence. There's a difference between pushing back on a news story and calling the entire free press the enemy of the people. You don't seem to recognize those distinctions, or you don't care about them. I care about the truth, Trump stated emphatically. I care about fighting back against lies. The media lies about me constantly. They take everything I say out of context. They twist my words. I have to defend myself. Cuban leaned back, his expression one of disbelief. You literally said things that are on video, that anyone can go watch, and then you claim you never said them or that you were taken out of context. You suggested injecting bleach as a COVID treatment. You called climate change a hoax created by China. You said there were very fine people on both sides in Charlottesville. These aren't taken out of context. These are your actual words. I never said to inject bleach, Trump said firmly. That's a perfect example of fake news. I was asking a question to doctors about disinfectants and whether they could be used internally. It was a question, not a recommendation. And in Charlottesville, I condemned the neo-Nazis. Everyone knows that. But the media cut that part out. The moderator pulled up notes. President Trump, the actual quote about Charlottesville included the statement that there were very fine people on both sides. How do you square that with condemning neo-Nazis when one side included neo-Nazis? Trump's frustration was evident. I was talking about the people who were there to protest the removal of statues, not the neo-Nazis. There were peaceful protesters on both sides. The media combined everything together to make me look bad. Cuban shook his head slowly. Donald, one side was literally chanting, "Jews will not replace us," and carrying Nazi flags. There were no very fine people marching with Nazis. If you find yourself marching alongside people carrying swastika flags, you're on the wrong side. Period. This is not complicated. You're twisting my words just like the media does, Trump said, his voice rising. I know what I meant, and I know what I said. I condemned the violence on all sides. I condemned hatred on all sides. But you want to make me out to be a racist, which is ridiculous. I've done more for the black community than any president since Lincoln. Cuban's laugh was incredulous. More than any president since Lincoln? More than Lyndon Johnson, who signed the Civil Rights Act? More than the first black president? Do you even hear yourself when you say these things? I passed criminal justice reform, Trump countered. I funded historically black colleges and universities. I created opportunity zones. Black unemployment was at the lowest level ever recorded under my administration. Black unemployment was already dropping for 7 straight years before you took office, Cuban responded immediately. You inherited that trend. And yes, you signed criminal justice reform, which was a good thing, but that was a bipartisan bill that had support across the board. You didn't create it, you just signed it. Taking credit for continuing trends and signing bipartisan legislation doesn't make you the second coming of Lincoln. The moderator could sense the interview was reaching a critical point. Gentlemen, we're running short on time, but I want to ask about the future. President Trump, if you were to run again and win, what would you do differently in a second term? Trump straightened in his chair, seemingly energized by the forward-looking question. I would finish what I started. We would complete the wall. We would drain the swamp for real this time. We would root out the corrupt bureaucrats who undermined my first term. We would make America respected in the world again. And we would do it bigger and better than before, because now I know who the enemies are. Cuban's face showed genuine concern. Did you just say you'd root out your enemies? That's the language of authoritarians, Donald. In a democracy, political opponents aren't enemies. They're fellow citizens with different views. The bureaucrats you're talking about aren't corrupt. They're career civil servants who were doing their jobs. This is dangerous rhetoric. They weaponized the government against me, Trump said intensely. They spied on my campaign. They created the Russia hoax. They impeached me twice over nothing. They raided my home. If that's not corruption, I don't know what is. The Russia investigation was started because your campaign had over 100 contacts with Russian officials that they lied about, Cuban said, his voice sharp. You were impeached the first time for trying to extort Ukraine into investigating your political opponent. You were impeached the second time for inciting an insurrection. And your home was raided because you took classified documents and refused to return them when asked repeatedly. These aren't witch hunts. These are consequences for actions. Trump pointed across at Cuban. Everything you just said is a lie. Everything. The Russia thing was a hoax. Everyone knows it now. The impeachments were partisan attacks. The documents were mine. I declassified them. I had every right to have them. You can't just declassify documents by thinking about it, Cuban said, exasperation clear in his voice. There's a process. There's documentation required. You can't just take boxes of classified material to your resort and store them next to the pool. That's not how any of this works, the moderator interjected. President Trump, the indictment alleges that you showed classified documents to people without security clearances and that you directed your staff to hide documents from investigators. How do you respond to those specific allegations? They're false, Trump said flatly. Completely false. Everything I did was legal and proper. This is just another attempt to interfere with the election because they know I'm winning. Cuban leaned forward. You're not above the law, Donald. No one is. If you committed crimes, you should be held accountable, whether you're running for office or not. In fact, especially if you're running for office. The American people deserve to know if their potential president is a criminal. I'm not a criminal, Trump said, his voice hard. I've never been convicted of anything. I'm being persecuted by corrupt prosecutors and a corrupt system. And you know what? The American people see through it. That's why my poll numbers go up every time they indict me. Or maybe, Cuban suggested, your most loyal supporters are so deep in the cult of personality that they'll support you no matter what you do. But that's not the majority of Americans. Most Americans look at this and see someone who thinks the rules don't apply to him. Trump's face flushed. Cult of personality? I have loyal supporters because I fought for them. I delivered for them. I kept my promises. Something politicians in this country rarely do. You're loyal to them? Cuban's voice dripped with skepticism. You pardoned war criminals and corrupt politicians. You commuted the sentence of Roger Stone because he refused to testify against you. You threw your own vice president under the bus when he wouldn't help you overturn the election. That's not loyalty. That's transactional relationships. Mike Pence betrayed me, Trump said firmly. He could have sent those electors back to the states, and he refused. He chose the easy path instead of doing what was right. Cuban's eyes widened. The easy path? He chose the constitutional path. He chose to follow the law instead of participating in your scheme to overturn a democratic election. That's not betrayal, that's integrity. And the fact that you still can't acknowledge that should terrify every American watching this. The moderator sensed the interview was approaching its end. Mark, let me ask you directly. If President Trump were to run again, what's your message to American voters? Cuban took a moment before responding. Look, I'm not here to tell people how to vote, but people need to look at everything we've discussed here today. The refusal to accept election results, the pattern of surrounding himself with criminals and pardoning them, the inflammatory rhetoric and attacks on democratic institutions, the fundamental dishonesty in how he represents his record. And then ask yourself, is this really the person you want leading the country? Because character matters, truth matters, and democracy matters. Trump stood up abruptly from his chair. I don't have to sit here and listen to this. This whole interview was a setup. You brought me here to ambush me with your liberal friend. This is fake news. This is exactly why the American people don't trust the media anymore. The moderator tried to interject. President Trump, we have a few more minutes. Trump was already removing his microphone. I'm done here. I'm not going to sit here and be insulted by Mark Cuban, who's just another billionaire elite who's out of touch with regular Americans. Cuban remained seated. I'm out of touch? You live in a resort covered in gold where the membership fee is 6 figures. You've never shopped for groceries in your life. You've never pumped gas. You've never had to worry about paying rent or affording health care. And you have the audacity to call me out of touch? Trump turned back, pointing at Cuban. At least I fight for the working man. At least I understand what they're going through. I don't judge everyone, Cuban said calmly. Just people who lie constantly, who undermine democracy, who refuse to accept responsibility for their actions, and who think they're above the law. If that describes you, then yes, I judge that. Trump shook his head and walked toward the exit. The moderator called after him. President Trump, are you ending the interview? Trump didn't turn around. I'm just done wasting my time with people who won't treat me fairly. As Trump exited the studio, Cuban remained in his seat, looking at the camera. The moderator turned to him. Mark, any final thoughts? Cuban exhaled slowly. I think what we just witnessed is what happens when someone who's used to being surrounded by yes men gets confronted with facts and accountability. The American people deserve leaders who can handle criticism, who can defend their records with facts instead of attacks, and who understand that public service is about serving the public, not serving yourself. So there you have it. An explosive interview that ended with one participant walking off set, unable to continue defending his positions. If you made it this far, make sure you hit that subscribe button because we're going to keep bringing you content that digs into the real issues. And drop a comment below answering this question. Do you think Trump was right to walk off the set? Or should he have stayed to defend his record? Let me know in the comments, and I'll see you in the next video.